So, good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk about communism. Unfortunately, I have a terrible cold. In the moment I can speak, but I fear the longer the lecture lasts, the less I can speak, and perhaps I have to finish before this 45 minutes when there is a lack of voice. Okay, the title of this lecture is The Actuality of Marx, Communism. Actuality, I mean in two different directions. There is a kind of constant actuality that Marx analyzed capitalism and gave answers, or his conception of communism can give answers to a lot of the big problems produced by capitalism. So in this respect we can say Marx communism is still actual like it was actual 50 years ago. But I think there is also a specific contemporary actuality in two respects. On the one hand, we have an increasing discussion and consciousness about climate change. It is not totally unreal that the whole planet will change in the next 50 or 100 years. And this climate change is not just a result of techniques or of industry. I think it is a result of capitalist industry and capitalist use of techniques, which includes a kind of imperative of permanent growth. Insofar, I don't see a possibility to overcome climate change inside capitalism. A precondition would be to overcome capitalism, and here again Marx's conception of communism is very actual. But there is also another contemporary actuality. In the last 10-20 years, we saw, especially in Western Europe, the rise of far right-wing groups and parties. We could see it in France with the National Front. Now also in Germany, who was for a long time in the happy situation not to have a big right-wing party, we have one which gained at the last general elections, the European elections in last May, 15% of the voters. And this party, it is growing. Maybe now not so much as in the past, but it is still a little bit growing. But it becomes also more and more fascist-like. It is not just conservative, a little bit nationalistic. It becomes more and more fascist. And just as an anecdote at the margin to this, now also a German court stated that it is not insulting to call one of the most radical leaders of this party a fascist. So we have it confirmed by the court. This rise of the right-wing parties, not only in Germany, also in other countries, it has many reasons. One reason, I think for sure, is the transformation or the fall of the social democratic project which tried to combine a growing capitalist economy with an increasing welfare state. This project, because of different reasons, is not anymore working, and I think the names Tony Blair and Gerhard Schröder we can use as symbols for the neoliberal conversion of social democracy. This brought in Germany, France, Italy, Greece, not only a loss of voters for social democracy. This would be not this alone would not be the big problem. The big problem is that many of these voters are deeply disappointed by political parties, by the political system. A part of them is just politically absent. They are disappointed, they do nothing. But a part of them, at least I can say this in Germany and also in France, is supporting the right-wing party. And these right-wing parties and right-wing groups, they have, when we compare them with the left, one big advantage, I think. They have a vision. The vision is awful, no question. That the migrants are guilty for everything, and that we come back to a closed national state where a kind of national welfare state can provide us with happiness, and so on. It is awful, it is not realistic, we all know this, but it is a simple vision which seems to be realistic. And the left, the radical left, not the social democratic left who dreams that the 60s will come back, the radical left has nearly nothing to offer. We have to offer a critique of capitalism, but we have not to offer a kind of realistic, rational vision. And therefore, I think the talking, the occupation with communism, this Marx concept of communism, is important. And it also has to overcome some tendencies of the radical left, or at least of parts of the radical left, inspired by some thoughts, for example, by Adorno, that it is already suspicious when you talk about communism. No, this would be already a kind of betrayal. And this, I think, is a very dangerous, very damaging position. But often there is also the argument that Marx himself didn't speak so much about communism. He analyzed capitalism. His main work has not the title Communism, it has the title Capital. This is true. But when we look a little bit closer to the texts of Marx, I think we can find much more, and also some much more details than what is usually said or what many persons expect. For me, there is also another point which became clear to me only while I'm working on this biographical project Tom mentioned in the introduction. There is a view of Marx that Marx started with philosophy, then did politics, and then at least from 1850, when he was in London, he focused on the critique of political economy. Okay, there were some single works like the 18th Brumaire or Civil War in France, but these are more the exceptions. The main cause of Marx thinking and research is economics. I think also this view is wrong. It is true that besides Brumaire and Civil War we have no big works of Marx, but we have hundreds of newspaper articles written for the International Daily Tribune in New York, but also for a lot of other journals and newspapers in different languages. These articles, they are occupied with very concrete political events, like it is usual for a newspaper, but nevertheless they are based on some more general political analysis, and also political analysis, the theoretical political analysis develops by these articles. For example, in the 1850s, in the mid of 1850s, Marx wrote a serial of 10 articles for the New York Daily Tribune about the Spanish Revolution in the 1820s. In these articles he discusses also such questions about the political impact of different kinds of constitutions. You can find this nowhere else. Meanwhile, in Mega, in this, you mentioned also this big editorial project, in Mega were published the excerpts Marx did for these 10 articles. Several hundred pages from Spanish literature. So he did really a kind of research process for writing a serial of newspaper articles. And I think we should take this more serious, these small writings. And now for our issue tonight, I think the considerations of Marx about communism, we have to see not only as isolated considerations, we have to see them on the one hand developing out of his analysis, of his critique of political economy on the one hand, but also emerging from this constant occupation with the critique of politics. It is not a kind of solitaire, these considerations of Marx. Nevertheless, I announced this lecture, Actuality of Communism, and since a few years I try also, I use this term in an, okay, I will not say aggressive way, but in an open way. A lot of friends gave me the hint, okay, I shouldn't speak about communism, let's talk about socialism. This is not so dangerous, because when you use the term communism, it is clear you have a kind of historical burden. We had in the 20th century the Soviet Union, a socialist project, which became one of the most awful regimes we had in 20th century, not only internal but also external. We also can speak of a kind of imperialism, of Soviet imperialism. And of course, with Stalinism, we have one of the most brutal dictatorships of 20th century. And here I think indeed it is not enough to say, yes, but all this stuff with Stalin and Soviet Union, it has nothing to do with Marx. Marx has a different conception, and it is clear that this is not the realization of any ideas of Marx. This is much too simple, because on the one hand the Soviet system, or the Bolshevist party doing October Revolution, was deeply rooted in the Western socialist movement, like also the parties in Germany, in France, in Italy, and so on. We cannot just say, oh, this is a different planet, we have no connection to this. And furthermore, when we look to the history of the Soviet system in the 30s, in the 40s, and even 50s, this Stalinist system was appreciated by a lot of very good, very clever Western intellectuals. Not only persons with a big affinity to a communist party. The attraction of the Soviet system was much more wide. And still, it is not so clear why this happened. Until now, okay, there are a lot of arguments why this specific system emerged in Russia, in which historical context this happened. But as far as I know, the history of the left reception of the Soviet model and the appreciation of this model is not written. There is still a lot to say, and insofar it is not my point this evening, but I think when we use the term communism, and I want to use it definitely, we cannot close our eyes from this historical burden. Nevertheless, what I want to do this evening is more to talk about a certain framework in which we can discuss Marx's ideas, Marx's conception of communism, the way we can find it in his different writings. The first point I want to stress about Marx's conception is that his communism is through and through an individualistic communism. It is not a communism appreciating the collectivity. It is not a communism submitting the individual to any collective institutions or to any groups, sacrificing the individual. It is just the opposite. And this is, of course, although a lot of points in his research, in his theories, in his approaches changed, I think this point is remaining. In Capital Volume 1, you can read about a higher form of society, and now I quote Marx, a society in which the full and free development of every individual forms the ruling principle. It's in the Penguin edition, page 739. And this, of course, reminds very much the Communist Manifesto, where Marx wrote, "In place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all." You all know this sentence from Communist Manifesto. But we have really to understand what it means. Free development is not a consequence of a communist society. It is not a result. It is the foundation. It is the condition for everything. And when we don't have this free development, we cannot speak about communism. We have, I don't know what, but at least no communism. The question now is, what is meant with this free development? There are so many liberals who also say we appreciate the individual, and of course we want the free development, and therefore we appreciate a market economy and a liberal democracy. These are the forms for the free development. Marx accepts this liberal idea in some dimension: freedom of speech, of critique, the forming of associations. All such things which were denied in 20th century from many communist parties and left parties. Marx, through his life, he never denied this. He started very early. His first article prepared for publishing about instructions on censorship of the Prussian government, written in December 1840, January 41, was exactly a plaidoyer for freedom of speech, not from out of moralist arguments, but as a social necessity for the functioning of a state. In this time, Marx was not a communist; he was a liberal bourgeois. He defended freedom of speech in order to support a liberal state, but later, when he was a communist, there was no change. The change is on a different field. Marx knows much better than the liberals, the later Marx, that for this free development of the individual needs means which he or she gets from the society. And getting these means in a really free society, what for Marx is synonym with communism, has nothing to do with any kind of exchange. So, the famous sentence from the critique of the Gotha program, with which he characterizes communism, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. This is just, I would say, another formulation for this free individual development. This free individual development is not, you cannot bring it together with any kind of exchange, where you have to give a kind of equivalent in order to get the means for your development. So the idea of individualism in this communism is much, much more radical. It is a deeper individualism, but also the reflection on the social conditions for this radical individualism is much more extended in Marx compared with the liberals, but also compared with contemporary socialists or communists. Nevertheless, this kind of radical individualism becomes a little bit more clear when we look to the intellectual roots of it. It is not just enlightenment which appreciated the role of the individual. The liberal individualism, I think, comes from enlightenment. One source which was for Marx biographically very important is the so-called Neuhumanismus, new humanism, which is connected with Schiller and with Wilhelm von Humboldt, and which had a big influence on the educational or on the reform of the educational system in Prussia at the beginning of 19th century. It was based on the idea that the individual is able to a kind of infinite perfection. That each individual has infinite possibilities, potentials, and when it has the conditions to develop them, that then the development is possible without a limit, infinite perfection. We can trace this idea already in the Abitur essay of Marx, the first essay we have from him when he had to do the last exam at school, where he talks about the considerations of a young man choosing the profession. Maybe you read this. There you can find already this concept of the individual, which I think is also important for Marx's later conception of communism. But we have at this point to be very cautious. This doesn't mean that the young Marx of 17 years already was a communist. This conception in the Abitur essay with the infinite perfection of the individual, there is combined with a kind of bourgeois elitism. It is a bourgeois conception in the text of Marx. And it needed a lot for Marx to overcome this. But this idea of the individual, I think it enabled Marx to learn in the following years. And from whom he did learn? I think the most important source after this new humanism were the anarchist thinkers, or thinkers who nowadays were called anarchists. In their lifetime, they were not always called as named as anarchists. Especially I think of Stirner, of Proudhon, and of Bakunin. Marxists nowadays, and also a lot of anarchists, stress the differences between Marx and the anarchists, the quarrels, and of course there were a lot of quarrels But there was also a lot of collaboration before the quarrels. And the collaboration was not only tactical, there was a common basis which is forgotten when we only look to the settlement of accounts in all these quarrels where Marx was a part, that he could criticize very heavily when there was a big difference. But this criticism very often covers the similarities and the common ground. The main difference to the anarchists, in my view, was not the individualistic orientation. I think this was the shared view between Marx and the anarchists. The main point was the reasoning about this individualistic orientation. The anarchists mainly praised the individual. They had some ideas about human as such. Individualism was very often an aim they choose by moral reasons. Marx tried to show that the development of individualism is connected with the historical development. In the Grundrisse, we can see his rather well-known but also rather schematic view on history, where he distinguishes three periods of history. The early period, where we have personal dependence combined with little productivity. It is the pre-capitalist period. Then, in the capitalist period, personal independence. We have no slavery, no serfdom, but an objective dependence in the social division of labor. And here, social productivity develops. And then he confronts this with the future third period, where free individuality is based on a universal development of the individual, controlling the productivity, controlling the social process. I think doing such kind of analysis, here we can find really the differences between Marx and the anarchists, but not in the individualistic base. Now, what were for Marx the capitalist moments producing individuality, and also what were the conditions for overcoming this limited individuality? Capitalism as a society or an economy where there is not only development of productive forces, of science, of technology, of production, but where this development is an aim in itself, in the very stupid form of profit maximization. Doing profit maximization by developing production without end, by developing science with no end. So in some respect, in capitalism, some social forces are free, but in a very deranged, and I mentioned before, climate change, also in a very destructive way. Already this should make it clear that a communist society cannot just take what capitalism has left. it must be basically transformed, and not these ideas we can find in early 20th century. Oh, we have these monopolistic structures, we just have to cut the head, and instead of producing in favor of profit, now we produce in favor of the people. By this, you also get all the destructive forms. To focus this break on one point, communism for Marx, and I think this is a very correct analysis, is only possible when, not only when capital is abolished, but also when money and commodity is abolished. Any kinds of so-called market socialism, they have nothing to do with socialism or communism. Maybe they have to do with a kind of regulated capitalism, with a kind of extended welfare state. But any market economy is really totally different from any communist conception which is rooted in the analysis of Marx. I will give just two quick reasons for this. With commodity production, we have always fetishism and the autonomization of the economic process against the producers. In a market economy, the producers cannot control the economic process. The economic process is an entity for itself which has a big impact of the commodity producers. So when communism as a society of free individuality, when this communism is, of course, it implies that the economic process, the social process, has to be controlled by the members of this society. And this is impossible with commodity production. There is another, maybe a little bit more narrow argument. In Grundrisse and in the Urtext Marx wrote in after Grundrisse, there is a nice chapter about the transition from money to capital. Later in Capital, this subchapter was omitted by Marx. I suppose he omitted this not because he had some doubts on this transition. I think he omitted it because it seems too complicated, too strongly oriented to the development of categories. When we read carefully the third chapter of Capital, we can find all the elements used in this subchapter on the transition from money to capital, also in the book Capital. This subchapter has the content to show that a full developed money system can only exist on the base of capitalism. It tries to show that a full developed system of money and commodity, but based on private production, but not based on capitalist production, is impossible. Like in value form analysis, Marx shows that you cannot have universal commodity production without money. The same strong connection like money and commodity holds with money and capital. Insofar, all conceptions of socialism which include a kind of generalized markets is radically different from the ideas of Marx. Nevertheless, we need some institutional preconditions, when we abolish the market, it is not just that then there is nothing. We need some institutions, some conditions to organize such a non-market economy. And I think that Marx also was reflecting on this, and in doing this, in some respect, he was continuing the Hegelian program which Hegel had in his philosophy of right. Now it's a little bit difficult, and this is only a side remark, to talk about Hegel, because talking about Hegel, we have to take into account that there are totally different interpretations of Hegel. And I cannot just easily say Hegel is doing this and that. Of course, there are a lot of persons who always deny this, no matter what I will say. For some, Hegel's philosophy of right is a conservative manifesto. A manifesto in favor of the authoritarian Prussian state. I think this is not correct. Others, and I share this view, see in philosophy of right the attempt to formulate the social, political, juridical conditions of the existence of freedom in society. Hegel, I don't want to say that Hegel gives the solutions to this, but I think he was driven by a deeply, what we now would call, materialist concern. And on a different level, Marx takes this concern. What can we say about this non-market economy? The term everybody knows, and which is also used by Marx, is planning. The economy is not rooted in the anarchy of the market, it must be a planned economy. And in Soviet Union we had an example for a planned economy. The question is, who is executing this planning? In the Soviet Union we had a center which gained power by doing this planning, and a lot of left critics demand, therefore, we need a democratization of planning. I think this is the wrong road, the wrong approach to this problem. In this aspect, in this respect, democratization would be the democratization of an authoritarian regime without overcoming this regime. Marx himself gives some different hints. I don't know any paragraph, any text of Marx where he is in favor of such a central instance who is doing the planning. He is favoring cooperation between cooperatives. We can find this in the critique of the Gotha program, and very, very short, very quickly, we can find this also in volume 1 of CAPPE. Can you just give me a hint with the time? How much?
Nearly 45 minutes.
Now it's 45
Nearly.
minutes. Oh, I thought it's 50 minutes. Okay, so I try to speed up a little bit. In Capital Volume 1, in the section on commodity fetishism, probably you all know this, after explaining what is fetishism, Marx is sketching a little bit different social, historical social models, the feudal society and so on, and at the end he comes to a community of free individuals. Perhaps some know German. I want to read just one sentence in German. He speaks of ein Verein freier Menschen, die mit gemeinschaftlichen Produktionsmitteln arbeiten und ihre vielen individuellen Arbeitskräfte selbstbewusst als eine gesellschaftliche Arbeitskraft verausgaben. Now I read the English translation by Moore and Evading, the old translation which Engels controlled. A community of free individuals carrying on their work with the means of production in common, in which the labor power of all different individuals is consciously applied as the combined labor power of the community. The German word selbstbewusst is here translated with consciously applied. When folks in a translation in many aspects better than the old one gives the following translation: instead of community of free individuals, an association of free men, working with the means of production held in common, and expanded their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single social labor force. So now the Selbstbewusst is translated with self-awareness. Both translations, consciously applied and self-awareness, I think they are deeply misleading. And they also don't show that even the German text is strange. The individual laborers, they spend their labor selbstbewusst. It makes, in German, this makes no sense when you take it in the everyday meaning. But when you remember that Selbstbewusstsein is a crucial category of Hegel, and not only of Hegel, but also of the young Hegelians, of the young Marx, of his friend Bruno Bauer, and Marx used this category in his dissertation, then maybe it comes a little bit more sense. In translations of Hegel, this Selbstbewusstsein is translated with self-consciousness. This self-consciousness in Hegel is also something else than the nowadays everyday meaning of self-consciousness. It has not very much to do with the individual and how feels the individual. It shows a certain type of self-relation. That the self-relation, the relation to myself, is mediated by a relation to the other. I relate to myself by relating to the other. And I think this is the sense of this word in this famous quote. So, without looking to the Hegelian and young, I would say even more young Hegelian meaning, the meaning it had in Bruno Bauer, it reads also in German as nonsense. With this term, it's always, I admit it's risky to take one word and to put a big interpretation on this one word, but I think with this word Marx at least circumscribes the problem of the communist society to do the planning, to do the cooperation, not mediated by an independent center, but mediated by our relation as a relation to ourselves. This is the communist task, this to bring in some respect this Selbstbewusstsein in a social reality. This, I think, in some respect is the big communist task which we have to solve, which probably there is not one solution forever. Some years ago, some authors had the idea, oh yes, a planned economy now is finally realistic because we have so quick computers. I think this is a total misunderstanding. The problems of planning as a social process has not very much to do with computers. The computers are a help, of course, like the phone is a help when I want to communicate. And when I have to do a lot of accounting, the computer is a help. But the basic problem of communist socialization depends not on the velocity of the accounting process of the computer. So, okay, I try to come to a quick end. I just want to give one quote from the Gotha program, or the critique of the Gotha program, where Marx, I think, he has a feeling for what has to be done. So, quote, within the cooperative society, based on common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their products, just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as the value of these products. As a material quality possessed by them, since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of total labor. In capitalism we have this indirect socialization. The private producers spend labor, and only afterwards they can learn if this labor is accepted as a part of total social labor or not. Here, in this communist society, it must be a direct socialization of labor. So it is needed a whole net of intermediations, where the net really is a tool for the laborers and not the other way around, like in a market, where the individuals are a tool for the abstract net. And this means that this net has to be negotiated again and again. It is not an entity which is for one time introduced and then we can celebrate 100th birthday, 200th birthday of communism. No, it must be as a permanent negotiation, which of course includes conflicts. A communist society is not a paradise where we love always each other with no conflicts. It has to be discussed, negotiated, the planning, what is produced, but it has also to be discussed the distribution. Marx nice sentence I quoted before. Now I have it not. I have it not in mind in English. I only have it in mind in German. But you know, each contributes about with his or her abilities. Each gets something according to the needs. This also has to be negotiated. In the past, it was discussed, okay, when someone has very big needs, we cannot fulfill them. Who should produce when someone wants a lot? I think this is really a small problem. It is, even in capitalism, we already have things for free for the community. You can enter a park for free. This means not that everybody wants to be 24 hours in the park. Or even in capitalist companies. Usually nowadays, when you go in a hotel, you have a breakfast buffet. And you don't see persons eating until they are overfilled. This would happen when we have a total poverty, of course, but when the basic needs are satisfied, then not even under capitalist conditions, this is a problem. But the problem we have now, and we will also have in a capitalist, in a communist society, and this is my last remark, then I really finish, is the ecological crisis. The problem that we can produce a lot, that it is consumed a lot, but that this production and in part also the consumption process is toxic. So the problem, I think, is not the big needs and the limited production. It is the other way round. The nearly unlimited production of toxic materials, of damages, and so on. And here, nevertheless, each to his or her needs is the basic principles. We have to negotiate about the needs. Is it really necessary, like I did, to use the plane to come from Berlin to London and to Brighton? Or when I want to see you, I have to accept to take the train and to use one day more for the journey. This, in communism, would be a political question which has to be decided politically, negotiated politically. Already in capitalism, the discussion starts about this. But in capitalism, this problem, I think, is not really to solve because of all the constraints. I have to earn money. I have not the time to use the train. But I have to come to earn here money, and so on and so on. These conditions would have basically changed in communism. And therefore, I think these really necessary negotiations about our production, about our consumption, which necessary in order that we can maintain living on this planet, I think the only chance to do them in a rational way is in communism. Thank you very much for your attention.
Very much, Michael. So we've got about half an hour for questions. So are there any questions?
Hi. You spoke a lot about thank you very much for talking. It was really, really tight. You spoke a lot about the abolition of money and sort of tasks of communism. what would you say communism's relationship, on your interpretation of Marx at least, what's communism's relationship with the nation-state paradigm? What's the task there with the nation-state?
Shall we collect some?
Sure.
And how much time do we have?
We've got about nearly half an hour.
Half an hour, okay. Then let's collect some questions.
Andrew?
Thank you, it's a very interesting talk. Partly, I thought what you were doing was undermining the possibility of a left Keynesian solution, a la Corbyn, because of the argument that there can't be a money economy which is not capitalist. But partly, you were trying to sketch the idea of a non-state communism. And I just wanted to focus on the second thing. I agree with you that Marx does try to avoid just the withering away of the state stuff, but certainly for his long-term conception of communism, he definitely tries to avoid the notion of a state, a centralized state which would do planning. And I'm sure that that is going on in that quote from Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 1, Section 4. But I just wonder if you could spell out a little bit more concretely than perhaps Marx was able to do, what this kind of co-planning or negotiated working out of how to organise our economic life might look like. Because you talk about negotiation as opposed to democracy, but modern theorists of democracy will say, well, it's deliberative democracy, of course, we're interested in. Citizens' assemblies, not just 51% versus 49%. And deliberation, that means negotiation, but in the end you have to come to a decision, and then the decision has to be accepted by everyone. So there's got to be a centralised mechanism for making a decision, and it comes back to the nation-state question, either at a nation-state level or at a global level. So I can't see how we avoid some kind of state, no matter how consensually agreed to, no matter how consensually people enact its principles once they've been decided on. Has Marx really got an anarchic alternative there?
Are there any other questions? Richard?
Yeah. I wanted to ask a little more about this idea of the Selbstbewusstsein and how much it really comes from this section of the phenomenology that you mentioned there. Because at least, maybe really the point is to highlight more of the young Hegelian usage of the category. But at least for Hegel there, there's nothing social about the relation between individuals, at least at that stage of the phenomenology, right? The I is yet to become a we. That only happens way later with the category of spirit. Now, of course, Marx is probably wanting to avoid theological terminology, but nevertheless, he also very much enjoyed this section on the individual and the animal kingdom in the phenomenology, right? Because that does criticize a certain version of individuality that transitions explicitly into a social individual. So I'd like to push you a little bit on that reference.
Yeah.
Okay, then. Okay, very different questions. I will start with the third one, but also I will do it very shortly because it's very philosophical. Indeed, I think for Marx, mainly the young Hegelian use of the term was important, and this young Hegelian use, or the use especially from Bauer, was not so much oriented to the phenomenology, but to the lectures on the philosophy of religion. And there, the category Selbstbewusstsein is in some respect the explanation of God. God can only exist when he is part of the Selbstbewusstsein of mankind. And this already Bauer tried to transform in a materialistic way, and Marx in his dissertation, where he sees the Epicure and these late Greek philosophies as the philosophers of Selbstbewusstsein, is doing another turn. So you are right, the paragraph in phenomenology is not fitting to what I said, but this is also not the real source. Communism and the nation state and the state as such were the other two questions. The first question, what has communism to do with the nation state? I would say nothing. Communism is on a different level. As long as you have nation states, you can change a lot in the social relations in the economy, of course, but it is not what really Marx anticipated as communism. It is maybe a step on the way to communism. But what was sometimes said in the Soviet Union, a communist state. This is, and the state, in some respect as a nation state, it's a contradiction in itself. The abolishing of the state or the absence of the state. I think you were very, you observed this very good what I said. I had also a part about state, but I skipped this in order to give you a chance for discussion and not to use all the time. Indeed, for Marx's conception of communism, it is not, you cannot bring it together with a state. But we have to look what really means state in Marx. State for Marx is an autonomicized social force. When we say there is no state in communism, this means not that there are no rules. But the point is, let us say here already in this room, we also have some rules, not even explicitly named. It is not that everybody talks at the same time. One person is talking, the others are waiting. This is a kind of rule. And if sometimes the discussion is very heated and people talk all together at the same time, then of course someone will say, please come down, wait what the other will say. So, of course, in a communist society, there are rules and there are mechanisms which have to guarantee that these rules work, that these rules are obeyed. But the rules are changeable from every community. When the majority here says, okay, it's boring, let's stop, then you can do this. Here is no state who forces you, you have to stay until the end of the lecture, otherwise you will not have a breakfast tomorrow or such thing. So the rules are permanent, under discussion. And so are also the mechanisms of which shall guarantee to obey the rules. A state is the opposite. A state on different levels has rules which are fixed for much more time. This is important for the state so that all the institutions of the state can work. That they are on the one hand predictable for the citizens, but also that they can organize their work. And this means the society and the state are separated. No matter what the teachers in school tell you when they teach politics or I don't know what is the name of the school subject in Great Britain, that this state is the state of all of us, and we have general elections, we rule, we elect the government. No, the state is not the state of the society. Elections in this state is only the peaceful method to get rid of a government which is not anymore liked. But it is not really an intervention in politics. This is what the Paris Commune practiced, that you have delegates, but these delegates have to follow the imperatives of their voters, and they can draw back at every time. And this Paris Commune for Marx was a kind of model for a communist society without state. They had rules, they had institutions, but not in this independent way we have in the bourgeois society. And insofar, I confirm communism in the sense of Marx is not possible with a state.
Bob?
I want to press you on exactly where you finished. If that's right, then what do we do? Do we have to wait for the withering away of the state before we can move towards communism? And how are we to understand the current state of affairs regarding nation states, where to the extent that nation states are, at least on some views, becoming less important, they're being replaced by global corporations, which hardly seem to be the sorts of things within which communism could work. So, do we really have to get rid of states before we can be serious communists?
Can I take a couple of other questions as well? There was another one.
So Marx wrote about stages to get to sort of non-state communism. So maybe because in order for that to happen, in order for us to dissolve the state, obviously we need to change the mindset and kind of social structure that's formed from state capitalism and so on. So maybe something like, as you mentioned, like a Corbyn-esque government, and then kind of state communism, and then we could kind of go like that in stages to dissolve the state over time, but also working more towards achieving communism simultaneously.
The last I didn't understand. Could you?
So perhaps I was wondering if stages of breaking away from the state and also stages of implementing communism over a long term, a longer period, would be an effective way of achieving Marxist communism.
There was another question at the back, I guess.
I was just reading Rudolf Rocker recently, who said that different anarchist economic theories can coexist under a stateless system. Do you believe that this could almost contain communism as well, so that there could be some sort of reuniting of the anarchists and the Marxists?
Sorry, I didn't understand. If I mean that different systems can exist simultaneously.
So under capitalism you've got different types, so libertarianism, social democracy.
Different types of communism.
So different schools of anarchism, he believes that they can all get along. Do you think that would be the same with stateless communism and anarchism and different socialist ideologies?
Okay.
Do you want to respond?
Okay, then there is no other question. It's more or less everything has to do with state. Withering away, the state withers away. On the one hand, it's a nice formulation. but I think in some respect it's wrong. The state will not withering away. You have institutions, you have persons, you have power resources. So you must actively change this. You must, when you have, for example, police, military, we don't speak about communism, we speak about like a change to a little bit more welfare state like Allende tried to realize in Chile in 71. And he failed because he didn't take the power of police, of the military. So even long before we talk about such a thing of communism, even a reformist government must change certain structures. And now imagine the nice situation, you have communist revolutions at different places. Then you have to do this much more actively. So, now I come to the limits of my English. In German, I would say the state is not withering away, he needs an active Sterbehelfer, a person who helps to die. And this is not everything before this happens, and then finally communism starts. The development of communism is combined with this active dying of the state. And insofar, what you said with stages, yeah, maybe you can, or there are stages, but probably we cannot predict these stages. Later, a historian of communism can discover, oh yes, there were certain stages. Marx himself makes a very cautious attempt in the critique of the Gotha Programme that he distinguishes an early period of communism where communism just emerges from the old society and therefore bears the marks, the stamps of this old society. And then the communism in a later period which stands on its own ground, which is completely emancipated from the old society. And this, I think, is a good distinction, but I would have now problems to sketch the 5 stages to communism or such a thing. Different socialism, communism, and so on, yes. Communism in Marx's sense, and here he's very close to the anarchists, rests on cooperatives. The cooperatives have to cooperate among them in a different range. For example, when you produce bread, you need the flour, you have the production chain is not so long, maybe some local connections are enough. When you produce cell phones, you need certain rare elements of metals and so on, which you cannot find everywhere, so a much bigger coordination and cooperation is necessary. But this doesn't imply, when for example a cooperative here in Great Britain cooperates with a Chinese cooperative which is producing these rare metals, this doesn't imply that everything what exists here in Great Britain has a copy in China. The people there, maybe they found different solutions. The critical point is do we have a market economy or not? When we have, in some parts of the world, a kind of communism, and in other, a non-market communism, and in other parts of the world still a market economy, there is a big danger that the market economy will spread. It doesn't need an imperialist who wants this. It is the logic of the things that the market economy undermines this communist economy. But what we had also in the history, very often you have a society where money doesn't play an important role, contacts with an economy, with a money economy, and after a while the non-monetary relations were totally undermined. This, I think, would be a real big problem. But to organize the non-monetary economy in a different way in the UK, or in UK only used as a geographical term, not as a political term, and in a Chinese region, I think this is no harm. And people can visit each other, can see, oh, how is your practice? What are you doing? Maybe we can learn also from your solutions something. And so far, I wouldn't say a problem between different kinds of communism. I see a problem between market and non-market economy.
We've got a bit more time, yeah. Rob.
On the question of markets, I mean, there are some sort of fairly sophisticated defences of some kind of individual market that you have in a kind of value for me orbits from Karatani, for example. He might be in favour of things like let schemes. You see that as compatible with some sort of, I don't know whether you might not call it communism necessarily, but some sort of post-capitalist libertarian society. I do see the point about money itself being kind of problematic, but you have to sort of perhaps put it into a perspective where the role that money plays within capitalism, and that Marx was thinking of in that part of the Grundriss that you talk about, is something probably categorically distinct from the role that money played at other points in human history. And you can go back deep into the archaeological record and find things like axe heads being used as something that may have been a kind of general equivalent. And then, the question of prisoners using cigarettes as a kind of form of money and so on. If you accept that this kind of diversity of forms of money, it seems to me kind of unrealistic to imagine that one might be able to completely eradicate such things in a post-capitalist world. What's to stop people from developing some kind of general equivalent for the sake of trading their extra socks or whatever it is, and to imagine that you could do away with that, you'd have to suppress it in a way that would be extremely authoritarian. But I would have thought that it would be possible to have a dynamic which actually actively undermined the need for such a thing, and that would be the provision of subsistence goods to such a level that there was absolutely no need to ever work for a wage.
Are there any other questions? Yes?
Thanks a lot. You talked a lot about kind of egotism and the individualism of both the system and also the rules of the free individual from work movement. I thought, could you say something about kind of the importance of working class struggle at the point of production as part of this, the actuality of Marx's communism a little bit, given we're undergoing 8 days of strike action in terms of UCU next year, the kind of bonds and solidarity, that Marx saw emerging from French socialist workers in the 1840s up to the Paris Commune and so on. Thanks.
Yes, Andrew.
I've just got, sorry to come back, I've got a quick thought about your suggestion that a money economy necessarily undermines post-money economy. I think there's a quote somewhere in Hegel in the Philosophy of Right where he says that in nations where there's a higher level of consciousness, people are willing to accept more taxation. The implication being that they have a kind of recognition or an acknowledgement of their interrelationship and of the relative unimportance of my property being mine no matter what, in a kind of Nazikian way. And so they're more willing to accept taxes. So couldn't you take the same sort of argument and say when the human race reaches a certain level of consciousness, they wouldn't want to slip back into thinking of things as their own private property any more than the average person in this room would want to slip back into thinking of torture as an appropriate means of government?
Okay, there's...
Sorry, one more.
Could you speculate as to how and whether under a communist system the internet would have been created and developed, and how you speculate that it would have...
Pardon, I didn't understand. Speculate under communist conditions, what was invented?
How the internet would have been, the World Wide Web would have been developed, and how it may have developed and been made available to everybody under a communist system. Just a sort of speculation, really.
Yeah. I think we'd probably better make that the last question. That's a very quick one. No? Okay.
Yeah. Two questions there about money. Yes, I will start with the higher level of consciousness. This would be a nice development when people are living in a communist society, and because not the whole world is communist, they need some trade with a not communist society, and they have the consciousness we resist any undermining. But the problem is, I think, not the individual consciousness, it is a problem of logic. When such a community has to have trade with a capitalist or a monetary exterior, it must produce according to a different logic, in order that the communist society can buy something from the not communist society. They have to sell something. Insofar they have to produce for selling and not for needs. So no matter what consciousness they have, the production logic is changing. And this, I think, is the real undermining point. Of course, when people are very clear about this, there are different ways how to deal with this, how to cope with this, but at least from the structural side there is a big danger. I will not say a necessity, an absolute necessity, but at least a big danger. Now when I understood you correctly, it was not exactly the same direction, but you said we have not only money in capitalism, but also money in many other situations. And if this not gives a possibility that money still exists, will exist, and what is this, the oppression when persons want to do this? First, I think whenever we will get a communist society, there is never a guarantee that this will not develop in another way. This is the most dangerous what leftists can do, like they did in East Germany or in the Soviet Union. We have to defend our model even when people don't want this. No, when people don't want this, then we have to accept, when we promote something, we were not convincing enough. And when people leave the state, or leave the communist model, prefer to live in in a capitalist state, we cannot say, oh, it is the bourgeois press who changes the mind. No, we have to say, yes, of course, what else should the bourgeois press do? We were too weak or too less convincing to resist to this. And insofar, there is no guarantee that after 1, 2, 3 generations of communism, a young generation says, oh, we heard in capitalism it was a wild, rough time and maybe it's better. Okay, then it will happen. But regarding the money, we have to distinguish. You mentioned the cigarette currency after World War II in Germany. You had a commodity production, still you had private property, but the official money, the old German Reichsmark, was totally out of use, out of question. And in the commodity production, you need a general equivalent. Exactly what Marx is analyzing in value form analysis, I would say, is this currency of cigarettes a proof. Or in some Latin American countries where with a big inflation, the national currency was not accepted, they used the US dollar. This confirms, I think, this analysis. When you go back in history, things become a little bit more complicated. You have nowhere a full money commodity which is at the same time not capitalistic. You have communities where other relations of production are dominating. Production with slaves, serfdom. And then you have some small areas where money is used, and very often it is not money in our sense. There is a lot of retrospective analysis of historians. Last year or the year before, an old German historian, retired since long, wrote a nice book. The title translated would be The Coin. He's an expert for medieval times. And with a lot of historical examples, he tries to show that in the 11th, 12th century in Europe, we had no money. We had coins which had certain functions embedded in a total social system with religious, with relations of honor and so on. We just name this money because it is a coin, we speak of the value of the coin, but it is something different what we have today. And in so far, I wouldn't say, oh, we always had money but in different forms. No, we had very different things. Working class struggle, solidarity. I spoke about the individual, yeah. The workers are nevertheless individuals. The class struggle, in first instance, is a struggle to survive. It is not a struggle for a different society. In the first instance, it is an absolute necessary struggle in a capitalist society to survive, to improve living conditions, to improve working conditions, and as long as we have capitalism, this will be necessary. This class struggle causes learning processes, and maybe people come to the inside, okay, always fighting against these symptoms, fighting against the consequences of the capitalist system is not enough. We have to attack the capitalist system in its core, and then the discussions start how to overcome capitalism. And exactly then starts also a discussion what do we want? And this also historically makes workers' struggles strong when it was not only a defensive struggle, oh, how we shall survive, but when it came really to the question, what do we want? And then very quickly, when some basic needs are fulfilled, or even before, for the people it is clear we want more than only the bread for the basic needs. Bread and roses. The famous slogan of a strike. And insofar I don't see a contradiction when I stress here communism as an individualistic project, not a collective, and which puts the individual in the center. I don't see any contradiction, or at least basic contradiction, to working class struggles, to strikes, to the development of solidarity. It is the aim when you want something else than only to repeat the defense and repeat and repeat. And insofar it goes together.
We're a little bit over time. Do you want to respond to the last question very quickly?
The internet. Here I must say it's a problem on the one hand to speculate, but I want to just to introduce another thought. How internet emerged. Now it just became 50 years old. It started in 69. It didn't emerge by markets. It was not introduced by capitalists. It was introduced by researchers paid by the state. So the internet is not a capitalist invention. Of course, capitalists and capitalism take advantage. They take advantage of everything. They are absolutely flexible, no matter what happens. They take advantage from this and form it in a certain way. In communism, a lot of problems would disappear. Internet nowadays is a fantastic copy machine. When we write an article, without any efforts, we can distribute these articles all over the world. Everybody can read it. It would be perfect in communism, but in capitalism, the article should appear in a journal, and the journal should be sold, well, not to you as students and professors, but at least to the libraries, so that the state, which very often had financed the researchers, has, with the libraries, to pay again to have the results of the research. Such, even under capitalist conditions, irrational conditions wouldn't of course exist in communism.